join us.
I've already
Would
done
that
that.
be okay for us?
Don't you worry.
Fantastic. Wonderful. Wonderful.
Okay.
Yes.
I will go back on his list.
Sorry.
I'll go back on this list of slides and program. I'll go back on it.
Which
When this is over, he said.
Oh, when it's over.
Yeah,
Yes. Yes, to get the email.
Yes.
Right.
So can you see my PowerPoint yet?
Yes.
Yes.
You can see my PowerPoint. You're watching this PowerPoint and you can now see, we're on the start page together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So I would like to ask you now if you would mute yourselves. And usually our tradition is people to turn off their cameras. So, you know, if you like to have a biscuit or walk about the room or do yoga or whatever during this lecture, you're not distracting anybody else. Thank you for being patient. I'm sure Alistair explained I ended up with a Zoom jam and I was in a meeting which was a piece of training I had to be signed off from. And I thought I was going to get away in good time, and then it all got a bit complicated. But here I am. And this is our term topic in nature's realm. And as often happens, I'm the person at the beginning, and I'm the person giving us some sort of historical overview here, particularly thinking about naturalism, the coming of naturalism, and thinking about the leaves of Southwell or Southwell. I've heard lots of different opinions about how the name of the place should be pronounced, and the only person I met who was a long-term resident of that fine city insisted that the people who lived there had the right to call it Southwell, but all the rest of us were to call it Southwell. So there you are. I will probably call it Southwell in this lecture because I don't come from Southwell, and I'm sorry if I've got that wrong, but that's what I'm going to do. This is where I wanted us to start. Somebody put this delightful image on their social media, and you can see this is an image from 1330 to 1340. So it's an image from the period just before the Black Death. And it's contemporaneous, if we want to think about that, with the start of the 100 Years' War, with the artistic career of the Lorenzettis, Simone Martini, I think with the writings of Boccaccio, just a little bit later than Dante, early half of the 40s. And what I wanted you to see was simply how delightful the evocation of nature in this manuscript is, but also to talk about the extraordinary characteristics of this early period of naturalism, if we want to talk about it in those terms. This early desire not just to reproduce the appearance of the natural world, but to look at it in great detail. If you look at the way in which this manuscript is decorated, for example, if you look in the top right-hand corner above the wonderful ears of the hare, what you can see there is what we would call sort of rinceau decoration, foliage decoration, delicate tendrils and little leaves. But you can see that that is treated in a very decorative way. It's filling up that space between the margin, the edge of the page and the text. But it's a pattern. And that is, it will look to it, and the leaves are natural looking and natural in their colour. But essentially what you have there is a very refined design. But when you look, for example, on the left-hand margin, you can see we have a couple of poppies. And these poppies are treated in a much more, observational way. They're not perfect specimens. We've got one which is a bit droopy, to be honest. We've got them at the stage where the petals have all gone, and we've got those, seed cases visible. You going to learn today about the limits of my natural historical knowledge and language, and there are people here who I'm sure who've got much better nature knowledge, and people who may have been engaged with things such as botanical illustration. So you will find that once or twice I'm going to be a bit vague about what some of these things are and what the individual parts of them are. But I think you can all see that this is clearly something that is reproduced either from life or certainly from a deep knowledge of those plants. And it's intended not to be the most graceful and elegant decorative way of filling that space, but it is to show that very specific plant. And as we look across the little collection of flowers along the bottom of the page, these are shown with uneven growth patterns, uneven leaves, flowers of different sizes. There's an interest in making them look natural and real, in observing them, and to think about it in a more scientific way of showing their various characteristics. In a couple of weeks' time, we'll look in more detail at still life and botanical illustration. But when you look at that poppy on the left and the way its leaves are shown, the way its seed case is shown, it's a very scientific study. And the same is true of the creatures, particularly, you know, the wonderful bee and the little moth. Now, of course, what we have here is that same lack of scale that you'll be familiar with from, for example, children's stories about different animals and creatures, so that this bee is bigger, thank you, than the two hares who are on the other side of the page. So there are certain areas and certain aspects of naturalism which this period doesn't engage with, and scale, as you will see, is one of them. You know, scale is pulled around with, so that even here where these creatures appear to be in the same setting, we have this sort of monster bee about the size of a cat. But we also have, and you can see, this very delicate treatment of the little moth. And these, we'll return to this manuscript at the end of the lecture, and a lot of the specimens in this manuscript are painted with such care that even quite obscure and specific beetles and moths in the manuscript can be absolutely accurately identified. This is a period of artistic transition in Northern Europe and Southern Europe. It's a period of architectural development, and you can see on the right hand side here we have a lot of the features of what become in England certainly the decorated style. So we have a sharply pointed gable, we have cusping within that, we have crockets on the outside of it, we have a sensibility around micro-architecture. So a feature such as a battlement or a tower might be, as we see it here, on a full building, or it might be miniaturized and used to decorate a page of a manuscript or a piece of textile or a small valuable object made out of metal or wood. This is obviously a fabulous scene, part of the story of the Holy Grail. But I want you to see how the plant, the tree in the middle of the scene, is shown in a very generic way. It's got a lot in common with the stylized way in which perhaps children start painting trees or encouraged to paint trees. You know, there's a stem and there's some leaves. It isn't in, you know, it's shown in these different colours which relate to the colours of the manuscript. There is no sense here of the shape of a tree or the scale of a tree or how a tree actually grows, or this being any identifiable type of tree. We know it's a tree, it's the sign of it says to us that it is a tree, but we can't identify anything other than that. And the artist clearly was not interested in that. And this is one of the big questions we're going to think about today. Why did people's visual interests apparently change in this period, approximately between the late 13th century and the middle of the 14th century? Probably the earliest manuscript in which we start to see this naturalism, even this natural history approach, is the manuscript I'm showing you here. It dates, maybe as early as the 1250s. It's a book which was made for the Emperor Frederick, and it describes the art of falconry. So this is a practical, hands-on book about the creatures of the chase and the creatures that you want to hunt. And I hope you can see that we have these all laid out for us here. There's a slightly staccato or Photoshop feel to the way that the creatures are presented, and they're nearly all presented in very tight profiles, so that we see in an ornithological way, we see their features. I was reading one of the articles about the manuscript with which we started, and it talked about how the Emperor Frederick and another figure, the German philosopher and theologian Albertus Magnus, how these were the two known bird watchers of the 13th century, which I think is a beautiful image, this Don from the University of Paris and the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire as bird watchers. But when you look at this manuscript, you can see what is perhaps being referred to, where you're giving technical information about hunting, types of birds, types of quarry, types of behaviour. You can see on the very far right hand side of the screen, we have a bird of prey seizing a rabbit. So we have observations of important moments of behaviour, as well as these rather formal profile portraits of these different creatures. And it may even be that this manuscript and copies of this manuscript, transfer some of these specific creatures. We'll certainly meet that crane again in our journey today, but also that because it comes from a technical and specific background, there is a need to be specific about what is shown. There's a practical need, as well as we might go on to talk about, perhaps a cultural or a philosophical need. Clearly the Emperor Frederick, he loved hunting. He knew what these creatures looked like. He wanted information about them which was reliable, which was naturalistic. Now, you've all heard me tell you the great story of art, that narrative around the Renaissance that we visit and revisit and alter in so many of these classes. And so you would expect that I would show you an image such as this. This is Giotto, or an artist working in a similar idiom to Giotto, as you can see, right at the end of the 13th century. And there is a naturalism here in the way in which these trees are presented. And also, I think this is one of the interesting suggestions that this either is an earlier stage of Giotto's work or isn't Giotto, is there is a naturalism in composition such that we have this monk on the left with a tree effectively growing out of his head. When you look at the famous works by Giotto at Padua, they are beautifully stylized, they are beautifully composed. Every rock, every tree contributes to the shape of the composition. There's something much more informal, much more observational about this. This is what happens when you take your camera out and take a picture, and only afterwards realise, oh, that person looks as if they've got a tree or a lamppost coming out of their head. So there is not only in the detail, but in the way this picture is put together, there's, as I say, an informality, a naturalism. And there is also the story of St. Francis and the idea of mendicant piety, engagement with the natural world, engagement with the mass of lay society, engagement with people in their everyday lives. We talked about the mendicants when we were thinking about those Italian townscapes full of miracles and sick children and local saints. And here they are again at the start of this lecture as we think about naturalism and why the natural world requires visual attention, why it should be copied with a degree of attention and accuracy. This is a detail from the very famous and beautiful murals in the Papal Palace at Avignon. So a sort of one of those places where northern and southern art meet in this period, and the innovations of artists such as Giotto and Duccio are combined, particularly in the person of Simone Martini, who goes and works at the court at Avignon, and combined with the different directions which naturalism had taken in Northern Europe. And what I want you to see here is how there is a pleasure here in the idea of nature and the detail of nature and creating this natural setting. And just as we saw that interest in hunting in Frederick's manuscript, here you can see that delight in being in the natural world in this scene of country life. The other factor, alongside the mendicant tradition, which is perhaps important here, and we'll come back to this, this is a factor which is particularly drawn on by Pevsner in his famous discussion of the Leaves of Southwell, is what's called the encyclopedic tradition. So this is a tradition associated with the development of universities in the 13th century. Certain universities were founded in the 12th century or even existing before then in southern Europe. But the 13th century is the great age of scholasticism. And one aspect of that was encyclopedic writings, so copying the writings of the classical world, but particularly being interested in formulating and bringing together knowledge of lots and lots of classical authors. And this is Bartholomew the Englishman, Bartholomeus Anglicanus. He's one of these dons at the University of Paris in the middle of the 13th century. And following the ancients, he writes this book about the property of things. And he talks about, natural history, the natural world, trees, plants, animals. This, as you can see, is a very beautiful sort of Northern Renaissance, late 14th century image. This, in a sense, artistically is where we're going to get to at the end of this session. But what I wanted you to see here in the image is that sense of theology and natural history and how they sit together. That the beauty of creation and the study of theology and the pursuit of faith, this is a period in which these are not seen as on the whole in conflict with one another. Vincent of Beauvais, who was another mighty writer of encyclopedias, he wrote the great Speculum Historiale, the Mirror of History, a great book about everything that had ever happened in the world. He talked about how appreciation of the beauty of nature created religious feelings in people, and this is something that comes out of university study. It comes out of the availability of libraries, particularly many of those writers from the East whose works have been preserved in the Arab world in Latin form and that become available again. So it's a thing that comes out of the universities, but it is something which makes it considered both intellectually and religiously and spiritually good to engage with the natural world in all of its extraordinary variety and beauty. And this is Simone Martini, who I've mentioned already, his title page for Petrarch's Virgil. So here we've got more explicitly that classical influence coming through directly from the classical world. Obviously, Virgil's writings, his eclogues, praising rural life, rural pursuits. And Martini does something extraordinary here. On the one hand, he shows with a lot of careful naturalism, the man, for example, milking the goat, the man dressing the vine, but also he adopts a visual style of having these figures, white and pale. So there is a visual nod to classical art here. Very, very early example of Renaissance art trying to look like classical art, you think this is like a relief, marble relief carving, or perhaps particularly it's like the appearance of a cameo, and you have these standout white figures against the background. And I hope you can see we have a level of naturalism here. So, for example, those trees, their foliage is differentiated, but their scale is still rather domestic. It's very like what we looked at last term with the depiction of architecture in this period, where the buildings look as if they were built around the people. And as we get to the latter part of the 14th century, with both architecture and with the depiction of the natural world, as in this martyrdom scene, although we're not operating with mathematical perspective, you can see there's a more natural treatment of proportion here. So this is something which is developing, and what's interesting, I think, about what we're going to look at today, we're going to be in at the beginning, and we're going to see which aspects of naturalism were and weren't of particular interest to these artists in the 14th century, and these artists and craftsmen of and sculptors of the later 13th century. This bit is just going to be a sort of whistle-stop tour of how people in this period may be thinking about the natural world. So the world is understood theologically as God's creation, and it is good, but as this image from the Hokum Picture Bible reminds us, it is fallen. The natural world and its cycles, its seasons, can be seen as fitting with elements of the church year and the Christian story. So in this famous and beautiful painting by Piero della Francesca, you can see on the left-hand side we have the bare trees, on the right-hand side we have the flourishing trees. We have a coming of spring with the rising of Christ. And the natural world is an endless source of allegory. So all that imagery, which you'll be very familiar with, of nurturing and growth and fruitfulness and fertility, all that sense of caring for plants. We talk about the nursery, we talk about the kindergarten. That language is central to medieval concepts of nature. And drawing from the New Testament onwards, you have all of those ideas of growth and fruitfulness in a sort of moral or spiritual way, being paralleled by the pattern of the seasons and growth and harvest. And the tree in particular was a very, very popular schema, a very popular diagrammatic form for showing the nature of different types of relationships. We'll see a tree of sin a bit later on, but I thought you'd be interested in this. This is the table of consanguinity. Despite the fact that there were relatively few written records in the early Middle Ages, the medieval church worked on a very broad list of people who, under normal circumstances, you were not meant to marry. And this was expressed, as you can see here, in the table of consanguinity. So this is a different sort of family tree, not so much the family tree that we associate with the genealogy of Christ or the genealogy of a monarch, but this is the sort of spreading branches of the tree. And you can see the prospective bride and bridegroom, touching this very stylized tree, but trying to work out whether they will be able to meet each other, or whether the interrelationship of their families already makes that impossible. The beauty of nature and the idea of the garden is often likened to the Virgin Mary, using the language of the Song of Songs. It's likened to her virginity, her beauty, and paradise, that way of talking about heaven not as a city but as a garden. This inspires beautiful images such as this. So, the garden is there at the beginning and at the end of the story of salvation. And as you can see here, the beauty of nature, the beauty of flowers and fruitful trees is a symbol of heaven itself, and used to depict this beautiful scene of people united in heaven. But I took my title today from the famous Leaves of Southwell. And if you Google this, you will see that Southwell Minster are celebrating this publication and the leaves themselves, and the work that they've been able to do on them at the moment. So there's a number of events happening. There's been some investment. As you know, if you're looking for somewhere for a day out over the summer, Southwell Minster might be a place you might be tempted to go. You can see from this slide that the dating of this building and its sculpture, it's a little bit varied. Obviously, if you want to really stress how innovative it is internationally, you'd be keen to push the date back a bit. Here we've got a generic date of circa 1300. This is a scheme that must have taken several seasons of work, and that clearly involved 3 or 4 significant sculptors, as well as all the other people who were building the building. Pevsner points to a date in 1293, when the Archbishop of York, Jean de Romaine, told the canons, so Southwell is a secular religious institution. Until the early 19th century, it was run by a community of canons, basically been run by these canons for probably just under 1,000 years. So although we call it Minster, that's in the Anglo-Saxon sense of a community. It's not monastic in the sense of having a monastic rule. And the place was in the hands of the Archbishop of York, and he told the canons that the fines which he made to them for not maintaining their own houses, so you imagine a setup such as Wells, where they have their own houses around the Minster, when they've let their houses fall into disrepair, the fines are to be given to the new work. And we presume that that describes the already started and ongoing work. So this is Southwell. You can see it's a fine early 12th century Romanesque building in its bones. It's then got a few later medieval details, such as that big west window. And the building we're going to look at, the chapter house, you can see is on the left hand side, with the pointy roof. It's octagonal, so it's one of these polygonal chapter houses, particular feature of English cathedrals and secular and monastic foundations, going back to, for example, the chapter house at Worcester. And Southwell is the only one of these polygonal chapter houses which dispenses with a central column but retains a stone vault. York, which is just a little bit earlier and which is twice as big, I mean, it is a big space, York. It doesn't have a central column, but it does have a wooden vault. So Southwell is rather unique. It's a very ambitious, architecturally ambitious building, a beautiful building, as you can see. If we think about its function, these arcades along the walls, very like that painted architecture we saw in the Holy Grail manuscript. You can see these would provide the seats for the canons. They would meet in chapter. They would discuss their affairs and the affairs of the Minster. And the building is, as you can see, lit by large windows and good for meeting in, speaking in. The publication, The Leaves of Southwell, it's a beautiful King Penguin publication. Some of you may have this at home. Following that tradition, about half of the book is simply plates and the other half of the book is text by Nicholas Pevsner. And you'll see here that the plates were taken by the famous Freddie Attenborough, the principal of the University College Leicester. And Pevsner has also drawn quite heavily onto pieces of natural historical research, identifying the different types of foliage which are shown here. I've put a link there. If you search for this on Google, archive.org has a downloadable PDF of this work. You can't print it and you can't copy stuff out of it. It's a sort of copyright sealed work. But if you don't have a copy of this book and you want to read Pevsner's essay, it's a really, you know, it's a lovely read. And I think, you know, it's a thing you might enjoy doing, or if you're, you know, able to go to Southwell, you can stick this perhaps on a device and take it with you and go around and look at all the detail. This is perhaps the masterwork, the door between you know, the chapter house and the lobby. You can see that the form of architecture here, it's Gothic with pointed arches. There's none of the double curves, the ogee forms that you would expect to find if this was perhaps even 10 years later. That's one of the reasons I think that the early dating of this has survived a degree of scrutiny, because you have very geometric, very sort of tightly drawn forms of tracery above that door. You can also see that we have the shafts of the dark Purbeck marble. So stylistically, this building, it has quite a lot in common with more contemporaneous works at York. It's also using that style of the pale stone here, the Mansfield stone, with the dark Purbeck marble that you see so powerfully, for example, at Lincoln. And part of Pevsner's narrative in thinking about this extraordinary example of early Gothic naturalism is to see this building as a transition between the dominance of Lincoln as a centre of architectural innovation in the 13th century, and then the importance of York in the late, you know, into the 14th century. You can see the date there. This is a book that's published in 1945. And Nicholas Pevsner, as you can see at this point, is lecturer in the history of art at Birkbeck. Pevsner had been at Göttingen. He wasn't a person of Jewish faith, but he was a person of Jewish ancestry. And he therefore had to flee Nazi Germany and come to England and try to make his way in English academia in a context in which there was a much less well developed tradition of art history as an academic discipline, and in which there was much less systematic study of art history. And I think what the book shows you, I suppose, there's two sides of Pevsner. On the one hand, there's the very systematic, there's pictures and identification, all of these different capitals, all of these areas of carving are identified in the book. You can go around and you can stand in front of each one of them, as I'm sure lots of you have done with Pevsner's Buildings of England. Oh yes, here's the decorated window, and here's the second bay, and here's the Romanesque column. You know, there's that naming of parts, that almost anatomical approach to particularly architectural history. But on the other hand, there is a sensibility which comes from Central European art history of being interested in the spirit of the age, the zeitgeist, the why question, really, the question of causality. Big question in art history, especially when we go back into a period where you know, artists are not these autonomous creative figures, which in a sense the mythology of art history makes them to be now. Why did somebody suddenly do this? Why is this so different? And Pevsner is he's very interesting, because he's writing about this, let's say, very Germanic idea of the zeitgeist, though doesn't use it in the German form in the text. He's wanting very strongly to talk about this place as a place in Western civilization, Western culture. That whole question about who particularly the Gothic past belonged to, which aspects of the cultural side of Nazism and the Second World War raised for people. The book is quite poignant and I think quite situated in the way in which it talks about that. And he talks about the how he believes that the sculptors who worked here probably had contact with sculptors at Rem, how it's thought, German thought, but mediated by the University of Paris, which is perhaps being read here and being understood here. There is a vision of a sort of world of wandering artists and scholars, a medieval world of a peaceful and cooperative Europe, which the book talks about in quite a poignant way. Pevsner is also, in a sense, a child of Ruskin. He's somebody to whom truth to materials and truth to nature are both very, very important. And what he's interested in, and you've been feasting your eyes on this while I've been talking about the background of the text, what he's interested in is the way in which not only are all these capitals decorated with very different looking foliage, so different identifiable plants, but that the sculptor in certain places, so for example you can see that on the right hand side of these three capitals, the decoration, the naturalistic decoration, has gone from being simply located in a particular structural element. So obviously we have leaves on capitals from classical times. It's a very traditional motif. But there you have a little bit of growth just going out onto the wall. It isn't structural, it isn't articulating structure. And Pevsner was interested. Pevsner had this very strong Central European sense of the creative power of the dialectic. And what he felt was happening here at Southwell was that there was a strong creative tension between a truth to materials and a sense of the sculptural form of the building, so the underlying forms of, for example, these individual columns. But there was also this exuberant naturalism. And Pevsner is he's quite clear that in his mind this balance is achieved in a very pleasing way at Southwell, that you don't have simply the imitation of nature as if we were in the Victorian Natural History Museum in Oxford, for example, and you don't have such a incrustating profusion of plants and animals that the whole thing is just smothered in them, like a building where the ivy has got out of control. Instead, you have a sense of form, you have a sense of articulation, but you also have all of this extraordinary detail. To get a sense of what he's talking about, this is part of the external sculpture at Rheims. It's one of the most famous examples of the development of naturalism, indeed of a very, direct classicism in 13th century sculpture. You'll remember that when we look at the story of naturalism and the Renaissance, sculpture always leads the way. Sculpture is always the art form in which naturalism in its most observational form is found first, and that's true here at Rheims in Gothic France, it's true with the Pisanos in Italy, and it's true at the end of the 14th century at the Charterhouse at Dijon. But I hope you can see here we have foliage around the capitals, and then we have a sort of rather messy, sort of smudgy collection of areas of foliage. So we have that idea that foliage is there for an architectural element, but then the foliage that's in between is rather, it's rather undirected, rather incrustating. Here we are at Lincoln. you can see at Lincoln we've got this pale and dark architecture with the polished reflective Purbeck marble, and you can see what we call stiff leaf foliage, stiff leaf capitals. There's a lot of skill, indeed there's a lot of poetry and dynamism and movement in these capitals, and you can see there's a lot of very skillful undercutting, so that the top of them in particular has this very lacy appearance, and that the drama of light and dark that you have in the materials is then enhanced by these deep shadows. So these are very beautiful things, and they're very skillful things, but they clearly are not representing anything specific. They're generic. They're not observing a particular natural form. Whereas at Southwell we have repeated careful representation of natural form, and we have that extraordinary skill in drilling and undercutting and showing depth, and I think this is one of the things Pevsner felt about Freddie Attenborough's photographs, was the way in which the shadows in photography also brought out this deeply sculptured effect in these leaves. So you can see there we have a roll moulding, which is almost a sort of lacework area. This is the doorway through into between the church and the antechapel, and then we have details such as this. So you don't need me to tell you, this is a very naturalistic leaf, and it's not shown with perfect symmetry. There's a sense there, an understanding of how the leaf comes away from the stem. Or these curved leaves here, you can see the deep layers of undercutting and shadow to create a naturalistic, informal, free, not patterned and symmetric appearance. You can see the same thing with these two leaves. You've got one we're viewing from the back and the other one we're viewing from the front. And these vine-like leaves with their strong veins. One of the things which is noticeable at Southwell, and which we've already seen, and we're going to see a lot more of this, is a lack of interest in scale. There are perhaps, as I say, perhaps 3 or 4 sculptors whose hands Pevsner identifies at Southwell, and there is a whole variety of types of foliage. You can see we've got buttercups here on the left, and we've got oak leaves on the right. But the flowers and the elements, all of them are made to be a similar scale. There's also evidence in the detail of the architecture of someone who perhaps came from that previous generation and who's still doing bulbousy, stiff leafy things which don't look like anything in the natural world. There is also, and Pevsner struggled a bit with this, there's also a disconnect between the beautiful naturalism of the plants, and many of these are local plants. He talks about the masons going off into the English countryside to look at these plants. There's a disconnect between that and the way in which human figures are treated. So this sort of green man style figure, it's obviously from its from the hat and so on, probably a older female figure. But although she is, she's quite characterful, there isn't that elegant naturalism that we see with the flowers and the leaves around her. So Pevsner ponders. This seems to be, licensed and maybe approved by the church. This suggests a deep engagement with the living detail of nature. How do we understand this? Is this allegory? Is this teasing and just playfulness? Is there a coming together of the sensibilities of high culture and then what is achieved in this extraordinary architectural decoration. And just this is, it's not very easy for you to see this, but the steeple Aston cloak on the right hand side here, this is an example of another object just slightly later with a mask, with these mask-like designs and leaves coming out. So, you know, this is a in a sense one of the more conventional decorative features. And there are places in Europe in the later half of the 13th century. Pevsner draws attention to Rheims. Here we have Strasbourg, where we see sculptors starting to depict the natural world with greater accuracy and greater care, and that's particularly evident in the you know, the sort of fleshy, almost acanthus-like leaves you have coming down there on the left-hand side. And Pevsner associates this with a change, particularly in the writer I've talked about, the Paris Don Albertus Magnus, in the way in which knowledge about the natural world was handled. So you will all have seen these lovely bestiaries which survive in England from the late 12th century onwards. They seem to have developed particularly in England as a popular form of illustrated book. Here we have the scene at the start of the bestiary of God, the word speaking into being, the birds and the sea creatures. And you can see here how the at least broadly recognisable creatures, we've got a magpie there, for example, we've got a heron. These identifiable creatures are shown completely confidently alongside these little wyverns and dragons. And in the same way, this is a detail from the Madrid cloak, a similar scene, but the creation of the animals. As you read down from the top, you've got in red there a little deer. Then in green, you've got a unicorn with a magnificent horn. Then you have a camel, and then you have a rather strangely proportioned elephant. It's not my plan in this lecture to talk about the ways in which the creatures that were depicted in these bestiaries showed either knowledge or lack of knowledge of the appearance of the animals of the world. Here, for example, you've got the various behaviours of the lion being depicted, and you can see that this is a very stylised version of what a lion is, set around very, very stylised foliage. But what was interesting about the bestiary was the way in which it drew together, in that encyclopedic way, all of the different classical writings about different creatures. And then it gave them a moral religious gloss. So there are two activities in the making of the bestiary. There's this Wikipedia-like collection of authorities and sources, and then we get the voice of the preacher coming in and applying sort of moralizing, sermonizing meanings to the subjects. So a lot of what is presented here as natural history is very much for a particular moralizing purpose. Here, for example, you can see this is again a sort of Northeast Midlands work made in Lincoln, given to workshop. You've got written there, Worksop Priory. This is the mother monkey. She has two babies, one who she cherishes and one who she neglects, so that when she's running away from the hunter, she clasps the beloved child in front of her, and she leaves the neglected child on her back to basically, you know, form a human shield between her and the baby that she cares about, and to be shaken off if the pursuit becomes too close. Here we have the fantastic image of the whale. This is as you see, a bestiary made for a Cistercian monastery. So this is in this period, this is the knowledge of the monasteries, and it's as I say, a bringing together of religious allegory and knowledge about the natural world derived from ancient authors, and often based around travellers' tales and myths and fables. I thought you would like this one. This is the crane, or the stork. And the story is that the storks have sentries who protect the colony while they sleep. You see the sleeping ones on the right hand side, and they do this, they keep themselves awake by holding a stone in their hands, so that if they nod off, the stone drops to the floor with a bang or drops on their foot and wakes them up. So there is the idea of these creatures and all of their interesting behaviour, but a lot of what's written about their behaviour is basically untrue. And clearly, alongside all of these actual creatures, we have fantastic creatures. So this, for example, is the manticore. It's another, as you can see, book made for a monastic context. One of the things, the big things that happen in the 13th century is the rise of the universities, the rise of the mendicant orders, the focus on monasteries, particularly Benedictine monasteries, as the places which have libraries and collate and transmit knowledge, changes. And we might see that in terms of a change from these magnificent bestiaries to a more observational approach. This is a little thing sitting between those changes, the war between the cats and mice from the parish church at Prug in Austria. You can see the very embattled cats trying to get themselves into the citadel of the mice. So this is to say, obviously, in culture and in the sort of folksy side of culture, and it's an extraordinary thing that clearly, in terms of both the nobility and their hunting, and the monasteries and their farming, and the daily life of medieval people, they must all have had so much more to do with the natural world than we do, and must in all sorts of ways have made stories about it and drawn meaning from it. My husband was reading a book that was talking about this loss of knowledge, and it said that more British school children are able to identify a Dalek than a dandelion. But it is extraordinary. These people lived so close to nature, but it seems there's only a point at which nature becomes of interest to them. And very often, as we saw there on the walls of the church, or as we see here in a manuscript, nature is used to satirize, to burlesque images which are cute, which are funny, which remind us of men and women. All those memes that you see on social media, they're probably all there in medieval culture, on walls of churches and in manuscripts. That sense of animals being like us or imitating us, or telling us about ourselves, or relations between the powerful and the weak, or men and women, all of that is there in these medieval images, alongside the more sort of heavily wrought spiritual allegory. And so sometimes it's in these stories that we see this naturalism starting to develop. This is a Book of Hours, and you can see the central image is a very solemn image of the crucifixion. Underneath it, we have a somewhat grim image of a corpse and a crow. And then strutting his stuff in the margin, we have part of the funeral of Reynard the Fox. So you have the death of Christ and the death of Reynard the Fox coming together in the book and relating to each other. And you can see how, this Chanticleer, the cock, he's a character, he's a cartoon-like character. But he's also depicted here with a degree of naturalism, which isn't apparent, for example, in some of the foliage that we see. And so about the same time that we have the carving of those leaves at Southwell, we have manuscripts in which detail, particularly in these early manuscripts, detail in the depiction of birds starts to be developed. The foliage here, you can see, is mostly still quite formal and decorative. It's not particularly naturalistic, although some of the leaves themselves are getting more of a naturalistic look. but the birds are extraordinary. You can see the sad story of this manuscript. Little Prince Alfonso died 2 weeks before his wedding. He was meant to be married to Margaret of Holland he was 10. So this book, it's hard to date the book because it was being prepared for an occasion, and then it was kept aside and worked on a little bit later. But I hope you can see here we've got that stork or crane, but we've also got a very recognisable pigeon with a nest of eggs. We've got various little birds, including a little goldfinch across the top there. You can see down that left-hand side how some of the leaves are simply decorative, but some of them, a bit like the leaves at Southwell, are more characteristic, more naturalistic. When we drop down the page, not only can you see the tiny little hunter there on the left who fired the arrow up to the stalk, but you can also see this wonderful and huge herring gull sitting there. You can see he's right in the middle between the coats of arms of the two young people who were meant to be getting married, and he's staring, giving a very hard stare to this very jaunty figure of little David with his sling on the left. Everything here is of highest quality and very, very beautiful, but there is an observational quality about that herring gull, as I say, quite out of proportion with the other figures, but he's looking there and sort of looking at them as if he was eyeing their chips down at the seafront. And this is a detail on the left hand side. You can see beautiful woodpecker and what I think is a kingfisher, very, very carefully painted, and the artist is enjoying these creatures, just as we saw at Southwell. There's a deliberate level of asymmetry here. He could have had them both with both their feet on that little knobble and both with their beaks going right up to that central, heraldically decorated bar border, but he hasn't done that. There's a playfulness that, I say this is a book that's made for these children. You imagine that they would see this. They got their noses up close to the book. This is what they would see. They would see that little foot. They would see the slight imbalance between those figures. Some of the figures in this manuscript are more conventionally, the dramatic scenes that you have in Marginalia. So here you have the man and the lion, and you can see here what I was saying about the foliage. This foliage here is much more conventional. It's in these fantastically varied and kaleidoscopic colours. It grows a bit like a plant, but in other ways it's not at all like a plant. As we were seeing from the start, hunting and that sort of noble engagement with the outdoors is, I think, important in terms of us understanding about this this sense of growing naturalism. And you can see here we have the family of deer. We have the doe suckling her little fawn. They are slightly, as it were, stylized, but there is a sense here of how they move, how they are grouped together. Another hunting scene, and above a little rabbit being caught. And once again, the image, the crow. In the middle we have the griffin, and then on the end we have a much more naturalistically example of observation. We have the magpie in the margin and that crow beneath. And you can see from the way that the artist depicts the the movement of these birds. I mean, it's not like first manuscript we looked at, they were all standing in a line in profile. Here you've got a much more fluid and dynamic sense of how these creatures move, how they look. You're not going to be able to, I'm afraid, see this very well, but we have this same interest in naturalistic birds in textiles in this period from England. So this is the Toledo cope. And although I'm afraid these are rough pictures, I hope you can see these are clearly specifically identifiable types of birds. They're not all identikit birds. In the same way, in this tree of the 7 deadly sins, the tree itself is very stylized, the foliage is very stylized, but that moth at the top of the tree and the owls and the birds within the tree are much more evidently individualized and characteristic. Here you've got the idea that these are, as it were, bad creatures. So there is a moralizing of natural history, but there is also a sense of the specificness. And we've got the same, obviously we were looking at architecture from Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire. The last image we were looking, the Alfonso Psalter, for example, is a work from London. And now we're looking at works from East Anglia. All of these works, I hope you can see, they all sit within a particular period, and they sit within really the emergence of the decorated style in England. So this is a style that's specific to England. And this sort of observational naturalism seems to be an important part of it. So these borders have got a lot more intensely coloured background in them. You can see how when they treat, for example, the trees through which the animals are racing, you've got all that detail that we saw at Southwell of the oak leaves and the acorns and the ivy leaves, but the actual trees themselves are not really, they're not really developed in the way that we would imagine them. So the sense of proportion and the sense of the overall natural appearance is not highly developed here. If you look up the little line fillers in that left line, about halfway down, you can see a lovely little line figure of a mallard duck, very accurately depicted. But the mallard duck is living there alongside the sort of dog dragon and the weird old man grotesque creature. So this naturalism, it sits alongside extreme inventiveness, just like the bestiaries where the everyday creatures are shown alongside all sorts of fantastical beasts. And here at the top you've got the folk image, the fox and the cock. You've got a moralizing image, the monkey riding backwards on the goat, so a morality against sort of hunting and hawking and all of that. And then you've got these specific little birds, so a little goldfinch up there in the right hand corner. Now the specific identifiable birds, oh, the little squirrel, you see the little squirrel sort of in the middle of the scene there. And the same sort of combination of a schematic approach and a detailed natural history approach you can find in the Peterborough Psalter in the individual scenes. So this is the tragic death of Absalom, the man who got his hair caught in a tree. We can see a great shock of oak leaves coming from the tree, and we can see all of this hunting and hiding, the hunting and hawking going on in the foreground with the fox and the dog. More hunting scenes here. This is another one of these manuscripts from the early 14th century. A wonderful range of creatures here, which you can see the proportions between the creatures. There's no interest in that. There's this same conventional form of a tree, which is a trunk and then 3 or 4 big leaves on top. We've got that little bird and then a hunting scene, another little bird. sort of rather unconcerned rabbit as the fox and as the bear and the lion and the hunting scene are carried out down below. And then above, you've got all these little creatures you've become familiar with, you know, the rabbit and the squirrel and the lion and the boar. And one of the questions we might want to ask, or we might find ourselves asking when we look at these manuscripts, this is another page from the same manuscript with a very magnificent J there on the left hand side and a little creature coming out of a little pretend hole above, as well as the shown from the side bear and hedgehog and so on in the top on the top part of the page above the text. When we look at these, we often want to ask, you know, do they have a meaning? Do they have a moral meaning or a folk meaning? You know, why are they there? And why was there suddenly this interest in depicting them in all their individuality, in all their detail, in observing them like this? And although this development can be quite strongly linked, as I say, to the decorated style, which is that most, you know, ornate and lavish form of Gothic that you find in England in the late 13th and particularly the early 14th century, you can see this interest in depicting creatures, accurately depicted creatures. Also see it in elite French manuscripts. So you can see here the Red Admiral butterfly alongside the monkey. You can see the dragonfly coming down there and the pheasant. Here, most of those leaves, for example, are still, you know, pink and decorative. They move about in a sort of sinuous way, but they're not naturalistic in that sense. And the scale, obviously, the butterfly compared to the monkey there. But you've also got that bellflower coming down on the left-hand side. That same stem, which on the one hand seems to produce sort of decorative and colourful flowers, on the other hand is producing a very accurately depicted flower. And there in the bottom you've got a snail, you've got another butterfly. Again, you've got some more naturalistic looking a sort of pea family flower there with little tendrils. So where is this coming from, this style in which we have a great desire to show particularly birds here, look top left here, and also wild creatures with a degree of naturalism and certainly with a lot of animation. But on the other hand, elements such as trees are still being treated very variably, as we've seen. Even the same artist in the same manuscript, they can show, as here, they show the leaves with beautiful naturalism, but they show the tree in a much more schematic way. Sometimes it is because these elements are just part of the vocabulary, the decorative vocabulary of what we call the decorated style. It's a style which is about a profusion of decoration. And you can see here in this beautiful embroidery those rather wonderfully articulated oak leaves and little acorns on the left hand side. They're shown with beautiful minute naturalism, but they're then deployed in this entirely regimented and symmetrical way, coming down the divisions between the individual figures on the cope. So maybe there's an idea here about oak and sort of sturdiness and so on, but also there's a sense of just delight in those sinuous natural shapes. Pevsner feels that probably one of the elements here is a greater observational engagement with nature coming out of this encyclopedic tradition. And he quotes a very long passage by the Parisian Don Albertus Magnus talking about the oak. As Pevsner says, it's a rather dull passage or heavy passage to read because Albertus Magnus is trying to create really a sort of natural history description of the oak and the way in which it grows and the way in which its wood is used in a context in which the language for that doesn't really yet exist. But it's very noticeable that he is one of those writers who is interested in going out and observing how things are now, how things look in the hedgerows, how the wood is used in building. Earlier writers, so for example, Hildegard of Bingen is another writer who Pevsner shows a lot of interest in, but because her focus is very medicinal. So she says relatively little about the oak because it, in her mind, it doesn't have any very important or substantial medicinal uses. So there is this interest which comes out of an intellectual and religious tradition, but which values this sense of the particularity, the detail of the natural world, and that this is something that can be enjoyed and displayed and celebrated, and that can be used to enhance various forms of moral lesson. You can see here the little goldfinches in the top left in this tree of sin, and you can see how this tree of sin is conceived like a lot of those trees we've been looking at. It's conceived as a stem with then a number of different sets of leaves on it, and the birds here are, they're bringing their comments, in a sense they're making their comments on human behavior. So that sense of nature as a source not only of resources but of wisdom, of revelation, nature as this good creation. And this is probably one of the most extraordinary images from this Butler Hours. The pictures in this book are very unusual, and they have a lot more in common, I think, as you could probably just see this straight away, with the form of contemporary embroidery and perhaps with the form of contemporary monumental painting, with wall painting. They certainly are very animated. I mean, in this image you've got that very frontal picture of the face of Christ. You've got the four symbols of the evangelists around it, so something which is very, very, as it were, holy. And then immediately above it on the left you've got a little woodpecker next to the great eagle of St. John, and it goes up into a tree in which you see the scene of the mobbing of the owl. So these other sort of crow-like birds mobbing and attacking the owl in daylight. It's an image that's used as a metaphor for the mocking of wisdom. But it's extraordinary the way these two things are brought together, and you have something which is very stable and iconographic and full of abstract religious meaning, alongside something which is much more folksy and which is rendered in a much more naturalistic way. This move towards naturalism is not, as you can see, uniform, and it's not even equal over time. So the Luttrell Psalter has got some little naturalistic details in it, but as you can see, on the whole, in terms of the foliage and the creatures in it, the artist here wasn't interested in producing their bird watchers list of all the local birds that they'd seen, or showing all the fruits and the flowers of the hedgerows. So there is a sense in which the different interests of different artists are at work here. I suppose the most naturalistic thing you can see here are the little unopened daisies that go up that right hand margin on the big page. Jean Lenoir is often credited as being representing the apogee of this late 13th, early 14th century ornithological and natural history tradition in manuscript illumination. And you can see a whole variety of little birds and beasts around the margins here, and some very, very tiny trees. And here, once again, we've got, this is the three living and the three dead is the main subject, but I hope you can see we have goldfinches, we have a bird sort of turning in the air, we have a very implausibly sort of determined looking little mallard duck at the top of a tree there on the bottom left. In that lower the lower left corner of the right hand page, the page with the three dead in it, we've got what I think must be, it's a little fledgling. It's a sort of little, you know, slightly fluffy, gawky, immature little bird sitting there. And then we've got a variety of hedgerow birds going up to the goldfinch on the other side. If you were an expert in natural history, you would be able to identify all of these birds, and you can see how the behaviour of the birds is starting to be of interest, at least in some cases, though I'm not sure you'd get a duck doing quite what that duck is doing. This is a slightly later work by the same artist, and you can see there's a sort of refinement in the way that the foliage is treated. But if you look carefully once again, yes, there we've got the goldfinch. We've got a little bird pecking down at the bottom. We've got a little wading bird with a long, or a bird with a long beak, about halfway down on the left-hand side. And there's perhaps an even stronger contrast between the clearly, you know, decorative, design-based foliage and these individual birds. In the last few minutes, we're going to look at some works from the middle of the 14th century. So we're moving here between north and south, and we're thinking about, I suppose, the background for the development of international Gothic, the blending of these traditions we've seen from the north with the naturalism of Giotto and Duccio from the south. And I thought we'd start with this lovely image from France. Pevsner has two different poems that he puts in the front of the book, The Leaves of Southwell. One of which is St. Francis's Hymn to the Sun, in which all creation is seen as sort of brother and sister, and fire and light and dark, and life and death are all understood as kindred. So there's a sense of the sort of unity of creation, and a sense that creation, all the elements of creation just getting on with what they were made to do, that this is an expression of glory, this is a reason for wonder and praise. On the other hand, he includes a little fragment from the Carmina Burana, which, as you know, is a much earthier song cycle, closer in its feeling to the songs of the troubadours. And this is a typical sort of medieval song, one of those sort of songs about, oh, you know, I'm really happy, it's spring, I can hear the you know, the lark singing, and everything is beautiful, and best of all is having a bit of a fun playing about with a pretty girl. So Pevsner talks about these two sensibilities, this engagement with the natural world, which on the one hand could be highly spiritual, or as we've said, sort of proto-scientific. On the other hand, could be part of all of the pleasures of elite culture, the things that are praised in troubadour songs, which are decorated, which are shown in secular art, in tapestries. We've thought about the way in which the practice of hunting, for example, might be part of this sense. And you can see here we've got this lovely landscape. We've got these still rather, you know, rather stylized trees, but we've got all the creatures distributed within them. I'm sorry that the definition isn't better here, but these images from the Coccherelli manuscript. This is the same manuscript that we started off with. The manuscript seems to have been made by a grandfather for his grandchildren in order to pass on particularly didactic advice about the 7 deadly sins. So perhaps a bit like the Alfonso Psalter, some of the elaborate decoration here may be about catching the attention and engaging with the young people. What I hope you can see, though, is that we have an extraordinarily naturalistic range of creatures. At the bottom there we have little fish and seahorses. In the middle margin we have a number of sea snails, and then we have these beautiful shells, all carefully depicted in the margins. And then we have all of these fantastic beetles and moths. I'm not the person who knows very much about beetles, but the work on this manuscript identified this particularly fearsome looking creature that we can see at the top in profile. So a sort of, you know, almost triceratops like creature. This is the particular beetle that's described in the caption, and it's a beetle that's associated with the bark that was used in tanning in northern Italy. So this is a creature that somebody perhaps has come across, you know, through that sort of practice. But you can see it's depicted here, you know, in great detail alongside the little moths and there's a little shield beetle there. There are little water beetles, little water skating beetles. The commentator on this book said that some of these are creatures that are so sort of unregarded that they weren't properly recorded and illustrated in the scientific literature, as it were, until about 1900. But here they all are in this manuscript from the 14th century. And it may even be that there's something of that thought we saw in some of those images of the, you know, the Tree of Sin, where the moths, for example, are associated with that. It's another one of these beautiful pictures of sea creatures and seashells with a very beautiful blue background. The sort of design that you have here, this sort of composition, is what becomes known as a scatter border. And I hope you can see it's rather different from those Northern European manuscript borders we've looked at, have been very dependent on lots of foliage. Whereas here, these various little shrimps and crustacea and seashells are depicted as if they were simply scattered around the text. And we have here, for example, these little moths, thinking a bit like a little cinnabar moth. Can see that that maybe the flowers and so on are treated fairly freely. When we're in at this level of detail, you can see that they've very much just been sort of, you know, sketched and daubed in, but there's a lot of detail in the way that those insects have been depicted, and the delicacy with which, for example, their feelers or their many feet have been added in. But this is an interesting manuscript, slightly later in date. On the one hand, it's got that, by now you can see how it becomes very conventional, this rinceau decoration with the stylized three-pointed leaves. But also within that, we have a tortoise, we have our friend the goldfinch, we have a little popinjay, a little green parakeet. And we have above that a very recognizable beetle. We're still working with this complete mishmash of scales, and we're still working in a context where you might have an entirely naturalistic depiction of a beetle or a bug, and then alongside it you have a you know, entirely hybrid and grotesque fantastical creature. And this is where we're going to go actually the week after next. Next week we're going to focus in particular on Dürer. We're going to look at his extraordinary and beautiful nature studies and the way in which he used those and developed those in his art. It's an aspect of, a bit like this, it's an aspect of Renaissance art that we perhaps don't give particular attention to. And then in 2 weeks' time we're going to think about you know, scientific interest in the natural world, manuscripts such as this which preserve details of different types of plants, and the way in which that develops into both a tradition of still life and a tradition of botanical illustration and science, and the sort of close observation of nature. I hope that you've enjoyed today and that you've seen why this is an interesting art historical puzzle, this particular specific engagement with the natural world which emerges in the late 13th and early 14th century in Northern Europe, particularly in England and in France. And I hope perhaps it's inspired you maybe to put Southwell on your list and go and see the carvings there, which I think are now going to be looking in very fine fettle. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. That was so interesting, and yeah, definitely feel a visit coming on when we're able.
I'm just trying to get back to the point where I can see all of you. There we are. Have you ever? Are you now all looking at each other rather than looking at my screen?
No. Yes, absolutely.
So you can see the boxes of each other.
No.
Yes.
Yes. No. Never mind. Oh, yes.
Fascinating. It's interesting.
Yes, David, I can hear you. I'm just going to take my mic off. I can hear you talking, but I've got a bit of an echo. I thought there was a question coming on there.
Yes, there was a question. A quick question. Well, observation more really. Fascinating lecture. You finished with the question of why did naturalism sort of come in? But it was obvious that throughout that period that both naturalism and stylisation quite often existed side by side. So artistic movements very rarely have definite beginnings and definite ends, do they? They're continuum.
I think that's a really good thing. So I'm sorry, we seem to be having quite a lot of background hiss at the moment.
Yes.
But if there's anybody who would like to ask a question or make a comment before we say goodbye for another week,
Yeah, could I
take that?
Miriam, it's Sally.
Hello, Sally.
We were a bit late logging in, or we started about 10:25, and it took nearly 10 minutes to be let into the room.
Okay, right. So that's to do with, I think some of you will have gathered, I had the difficulty that I was in another meeting until about 10:30. So I put Alistair in charge of the door. So whether he wasn't able to see the notifications that you were waiting, because when I'm, if I'm the person that starts one of these meetings, as you all, as it were, come up to knock on the door, I can see you, and I can see that you're waiting to be, you're waiting to be let in.
Right.
So I'm sorry about that, and.
Oh, that's fine. Just as long as I wasn't doing anything wrong, because obviously in the end I got in.
Yeah.
Tara and I got in. We were here about 10:25 to 11, something like that. So, okay, that's fine. No problem.
Yes, I don't have a reason to believe you were doing anything wrong. I suspect it was just that probably you were knocking on the door at the point where Alistair was having kittens about the fact I wasn't there, and I was meant to be there.
Oh, don't we learn a lot on Zoom?
We're always learning a lot all the time.
I'll see you next week, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Those of you that have access to the chat, the PDF of today's lecture and the form, the the schedule for the term. I mean, you know how these terms go. We never quite manage to do what's on the schedule, but pretty much the schedule that's coming up, I'm doing these first 3 lectures, and then David is going to take a lecture for us. Those are both in the chat stream. If you've been in the meeting from before 10:30, you should have those in the chat stream, and otherwise I hope you'll be able to get them by application to the centre.
Thank you very much, Miriam.
Thank you, Miriam.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's and I would commend the Pevsner's writing about this. It's actually, because it was written for this, you know, King Penguin series. It's a very kind of pleasant piece of art history from an earlier age. So
Yeah.
I think, you might find that quite enjoyable.
Can I just ask a quick question? What does the word mendicant mean?
Okay, that's a really good question. So mendicant, it means people who, literally, it means people who beg, and it's used to describe those so orders of friars, Franciscans, Dominicans. They were called mendicants because, unlike the earlier monasteries had been given big portions of land, and that was the source of their wealth. And obviously the Cistercians, for example, were great farmers and improvers of land. And what the mendicants did was they didn't receive grants. They weren't prepared to accept grants of land, and therefore this did become problematic for them, because they were just on a constant fundraising drive. But essentially it's that idea that you find in monasticism in all sorts of cultures, that you're meant to be dependent on the goodness of others, and you're meant to, receive of their kindness. But yes, that's what I meant, and primarily really talking about the Franciscans and Dominicans, but there were other sort of smaller groups of people doing a similar thing.
So were they literally sort of itinerant then? Did they not have a base, or?
They were meant to be, I mean, as I say, it's a bit more of an ideal than a reality. I mean, clearly some of these individuals, when they started out, particularly people such as St. Francis, lived that very, Jesus in Galilee, let's wander about and preach a bit and see if we get a house to sleep in tonight or not life.
Yeah.
But once it became an order, people tend to be expected to live in their monastic communities. And in fact, if you're to be always wandering about in order to listen to, ladies telling you about all their sins, or in order to get lots of money off the local milord. I mean, that people made all these accusations about the mendicants' behaviour,
Right.
but they were meant to live in communities. So obviously, famously in Leicester, it's where Richard III was buried in the Greyfriars, and they had a church and they had communal buildings there. And they also because their creation coincides with this great explosion of interest in universities and university learning. A lot of them are involved in early university development, and also a lot of them are involved in the formal structures of the church. So you have people they're a Franciscan friar and they're pope, or they're a Franciscan friar and they're the bishop.
Right. There's a whole world in all of this, isn't there?
Yes, and a lot of it is, as you can tell, it's quite, there are these various principles and ideals, and then there are the ways it all works out.
Yes. Again, well, a bit like sort of art history, where you want to chop it up, but when you look, it's like that all the time.
It's all very, very mixed. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you. Anyway,
Good.
Thanks so much, Miriam. Miriam, I do have a technological problem in that I still get this bar right across near the bottom of the screen, and it cuts right across some of the pictures. Do I need to speak to Alistair about this? What do I do?
I think probably best thing is to speak to Alistair. What we do when we make the PowerPoints, we're now trying, for example, to make sure that we don't put any captions in that lower part of the
Thank
screen.
you. I
But
appreciate
obviously, you know, if you can see the caption but you can't see the picture,
Yes.
that isn't better. And
Yes,
particularly, yes, you would be very aware of it today because we were looking at a lot of pictures in margins.
that's
and
right.
in that bas de page area at the bottom of
Yes.
the text.
I'm sure it's something that I'm doing or not
Yeah.
doing, but I perhaps need to speak to Alistair about it
Yes.
then.
I think
Right.
it's probably about how you view the screen. It's because I'm running the PowerPoint from my machine. When I'm giving the talk, I can't see any of you. All I can see is the PowerPoint.
Yes,
The PowerPoint fills my whole screen.
Yes.
So
I'm
it's
getting the
quite
same-
hard for me to know what you see.
Yeah.
Yes.
Are you getting, Marion, a strip of people all across the bottom? Or
It's
a strip of icons all across the bottom?
at the very bottom I am, but that
Yeah.
doesn't bother me where it's got the initials of people who are joining in. But it's just a bit higher up than that. And there's this bar with a red dot and then the time and then a camera, then a phone, then an arrow upwards, then 3 dots, then a hand,
Oh,
and then something that looks like a cup of tea or bubbles. And then I get a telephone symbol.
yes.
Yeah.
So that sounds like a menu which is somehow a sort of bar of commands that's somehow making itself visible in
Yes.
your thing. And I suppose it's about trying to find out whether there's a place in a corner of it or somewhere where you can cancel it. I don't know. Is this a thing you know about, Joanna?
No, not really, because I was thinking exactly the same. If you just tap in the right place, it'll probably go. But you also think if I tap in the wrong place,
Yes. Yes.
There'll be another one.
you can try it.
Can I just ask Marion, trying to help? Do you have a mouse, Marion, or is it?
Yes, I've got a
smartphone?
mouse. I've got a mouse here.
If you just use your mouse, just click anywhere on the screen, just once on the left hand, on the left hand clicker, it should disappear.
It's gone. No, it's not. It's back.
Yes, well, it'll keep coming. I mean, just click once, and then don't click again. And if it comes back, just do it again. Eventually, it will just go and not come back.
Okay.
It'll come back as soon as you move your mouse. Yes.
Yes, I've got the mouse. The mouse is moving along.
Okay, so just anywhere on the screen, click once on your left clicker, and it should go.
Okay.
And then you just need to keep on doing that, and eventually it will go. But every time you touch your mouse, it'll come back again.
Right.
Because
Yes,
that's
it's gone. Oh, it's gone just now.
Hmm.
right. So if you don't touch your mouse, it won't come back, And if it does, just click once again.
Thank you.
It's okay.
Thank you very much.
Can I suggest something else that you might not know? In the middle of that bar that's been annoying you, there's 3 dots.
Yes.
If you click on that once with your left clicker,
Yes.
you'll get another little menu that comes up, and on the 3rd one down, it says enter full screen.
Right.
So if you click that one, you'll get rid of everything else that's on the screen.
I'm clicking that now. Enter full screen, do I do? Yes.
That's it. And you see everything else disappears, and eventually this bar, if you click once again, that bar that's annoying you, if you click once again, that'll go, and then don't touch your mouse and you're off.
Now that says exit full screen.
Yes. So that if you want to come back to where you were, then you can.
Yes,
Right.
at the moment it will. What I'll do is I'll just share a PowerPoint for a second, because then you'll see that
Press.
you'll
Yeah.
be able to see that better, because obviously at the moment you're in that difficult situation where you're not seeing what you'd normally see in the meeting, because we're not when I'm not showing you a PowerPoint. So I'm just going to do that. I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint, everybody. Don't adjust your set. We're just doing this for testing purposes. So this is the form in which you would, things would be during the lecture.
Yes.
So see if you can do what was being suggested now. If you go into full screen mode, can you get to a point where you're just seeing the picture and the captions as big as possible?
Wait a minute. That says. I've got enter full screen, right?
Yes, so if you enter full screen, see how much of the other stuff does that get rid of?
It still leaves this bar near the bottom. So how about to try what Pat's
Yeah, try that.
Yes.
Kind of clicking once and then just hands off your mouse. Don't breathe. Walk away from your computer.
once again. Right, yes, it's gone.
Right. Well, yeah, that should be it now.
Obviously, I kept touching the mouse.
That was it. Yes.
Right. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Yes, it is so irritating, but I daren't try anything during the talk in case I lose it altogether.
Yes.
Exactly.
Many thanks. So see you next week.
Yeah.
And that will be great. Thank you very much, Miriam, and thank you for helping me both
Yeah,
of
no,
you.
my pleasure. Thank
Bye.
you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you,
Take
Miriam.
care. Go
Bye.
safely.
Bye.
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 Don't know how to leave now. Trying to leave. I'm not going. How do I leave?
Now, how do I get off, Donald?
Yeah, I'm trying to do the same.
How do I get out?
I can't leave.
Just, my husband's coming. I'll get out.
I don't know how to.
Let me sit there, please. May I sit there?
Yes, of
please?
course you can. Thank you very much, John.
I don't know how to leave.
Right, let's see what we've got.
Just tell me how to get rid of that bar anyway.
I can't leave.
Can't get the usual bar. Oh, there's a big X. That's helpful.
I can't leave. I'm stuck here.